a bunch of demoing to do. So we're going to cover a lot of the module, but some of you might have full work order management, so that will include work orders and service requests. We're not going to be going over the full work order management today. We're just talking about work records. And that means that whoever has just work records, this will completely pertain to you. All right, so I'm going to share a screen. So a little backstory. We had a way that work was previously kind of shared and used in Tree Plotter, and we, I guess, more recently implemented work records. It was always kind of there. It was always kind of part of work order management. But it's kind of a trimmed down version of it. So we're going to go through it today. The main things are work order management, or sorry, the work record module is there to create, assign, manage, report on all your work. And we want to make it as easy as possible. Okay. So my name's Maggie. For those of you that don't know me, I've been at Planet Geo for 3 years. I am the professional services team manager. We do customer support, implementations, and solutions engineering. And then we also have Peter Aldag here today. And Peter, if you'd like to introduce yourself really quick.
Hey, yeah, my name is Peter. I'm a Planet Geo Solutions Engineer. I've been here for a little over 2 years now. I started on the general support team, worked my way through implementations, and now I'm working on, again, solutions engineering. My main focus, my role is kind of helping people get the most out of the application. So work records is a huge part of that. So I was really excited to be a part of this webinar.
Well, so let's talk about what we're gonna get out of today, hopefully. So today's goals are going to be to go over what are work records. So what is this? What is the module used for? What are the ways that we can customize work records for your particular needs in Tree Plotter? All of our customers have different use cases for a lot of different aspects of their work. Some people are more focused on renewal or removal. Some people are focused on planting, right? Everyone has different things that they're after. General maintenance, management plans, like all sorts of stuff. And so a lot of it intermingles, but a lot of it is also possible using this work record module. And so we'll kind of talk about how you can get the most out of it. And then we're going to go over and we're going to demo specific workflows to create and update and assign work in Tree Plotter. We're going to go over cost information and reporting information as well. So, a couple things I want to point out about this before we start is a lot of anyone who I've done a work record training with will hear me talk about the filter a lot. So before you dive into work records, there's a little bit of a prerequisite knowledge that's needed in Tree Plotter with some other tools. So I wanted to highlight those first. So before we start, you definitely need to know how to use the filter. We're not going to go over how to use the filter today. We're going to go over how to use the filter for work records. But a basic understanding of the filter is super helpful when you start to dive into using work records. The next one is the mass updater. As many of you might have known, you have to apply a filter before you use the mass updater, or else you're going to update all of your data. So the filter and the mass updater go hand in hand. And so having knowledge of both before you start updating work records is really helpful also. Notifications. So in the hub, there's that notification sections. We're going to touch on it today and what that means. But the notifications and how that works, that tends to be pretty helpful to know. And then the last two are the data table and then how to access reports in Tree Plotter. So the data table, when we talk about work records, is very helpful. Understanding what the views button does and what the update button does and all of that, and how to export out data from the data table. All of that stuff is very helpful. And so all of these tools kind of get put into work records, which is why work records can be kind of complicated to learn and why we wanted to do this webinar today. So let's start with the basics, like what is this? So what are work records and work history? And so in Tree Plotter, work records and work history are the documentation of activities or tasks implemented or planned for your urban forest. So whether you are a nonprofit, whether you are a private tree care firm owner, or whether or not you work for a city, you could use work records for your work. It's really just about the planning of work, the implementation of work, and then the reporting of work and how all of those kind of interact. Within the work record module, there's two terms that get kind of confusing. There's work records and then there's work history. And so we just wanted to go over like what those are intended to be used for. Work records are scheduled or pending work tasks. So what that means is I need to do this work. That's what a work record is. Or the crew is going to go out and they're going to do pruning on these 20 trees in this park. That is what work records are. Work history is the work that's actually been completed. So there's a little bit of a planning aspect when it comes to work records that you all can use. And work records are the planning, the work history is what's been done, right? So you can look back, okay, we planned this, but we didn't get to finish the plan. Or you could say we did finish the plan and we did even more. So that tends to be really nice. Work records can be used for anything involving work. I've seen people use it for like inspecting trees also, although we do have a separate inspection module. But really any task that has to be done. So planting, maintenance, pruning, removal, stumping, you can use it, mulching, anything. Okay. And then let's talk about some more uses and kind of get more into that part. So basically work records are used in Tree Plotter to add and update. You add and update work records, and some of the work that you can do is either proactive or reactive with the module. And what I mean by that is that some cities will have a storm that happens, right? And then you go out and you do work to those trees after that storm. And so that's kind of the reactive side of work. You're not necessarily doing work to every tree in the park. It's not like a maintenance or planned work schedule. It's kind of just a one-off. Work records can be added tree by tree, right? So, okay, I went out and I pruned this tree because there was a branch hanging off after the storm. Great. I got my work logged. I'm good to go. The other side of it is proactive work. So it's really like your planning, like your urban forestry management. So if you have a management plan that says, okay, we need to remove this many high-risk trees, and then we're going to be planting this many in sites throughout the city. That's your planning. That's your proactive work. So work records can do both. It can do proactive and reactive work planning and executing. The other thing that it can do and that you can use it for is tracking and assigning. So I know that a lot of cities will use contractors for their work. And so you can assign work, whether it's someone on your crew or whether it's a contractor at your city. Using that kind of designation for that work, you can then set a filter and only allow them to see that work that they're responsible for. That tends to be really helpful in the work records module also. And then the other thing is you can be alerted for when work is due. So the due date in the work record controls when you get that notification in the hub. And so when you fill in the due date, if I filled it in for yesterday, it would tell me that the work was overdue. So that tends to be helpful because as your maintenance cycles come up with your trees in your urban forest, you can then keep up with the work in your city using that notification section. And then the last part is to analyze work at your organization using charts, graphs, reports, tables, and then we can also do cost management. So Within work records, you can assign a cost for PHC work that's done to trees that have a certain DBH, right? You can assign a stump removal cost for trees with a certain DBH or something like that, or you can assign a fixed cost. And so that tends to be helpful. Then you could pull all of that information and look back on your year and say, okay, this is how much it costs. This is how much chemical we needed for our PHC work this year. Let's anticipate to do the same next year or pull back a bit, right? And so you can kind of use it for budgeting and a little bit on the management and administration side. Okay, I want to dive in a little bit about the maintenance cycles and work planning because everybody wants to get to like that proactive work side of their jobs, right? I know, yeah, proactive work is better than reactive all the time. And so maintenance cycles and work planning are huge, right? And just this is kind of like an overview of a workflow. We're going to go deep into workflows when Peter starts a demo in just a little bit, but this is kind of an overview. So essentially what we would do using work records is we can filter the trees down that need certain work in the city, right? You visit every park twice a year, okay? We can do that using the advanced filter. And when we filter down trees or when we filter down work records, those two layers kind of interact with each other. So when you filter down work records, the trees get filtered on the map. And when you filter down trees, then the work records get filtered also. And so next, we can create mass amounts of work for the rest of the quarter, rest of the half, rest of the year for that maintenance in those parks. And we can do that using the data table. So the button in the top left corner of your app. After that, we can then assign it to crews working in different areas of the city or contractors working in for different in different areas or however you're categorizing them. And then we can get them working with routines or mass updating or even just saying, okay, I completed the work, right? Keeping it as simple as we can in the field is always the best option. And then tracking the work to be done quarter to quarter, we're going to go back to the filter and filter on the trees and the work and get to how much work we actually did. So it's kind of like this full circle thing. And you can see kind of the tools that are used within that process. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is work records and notifications. And inspections and work records work with notifications in Tree Plotter. A lot of you might have seen like a little red dot up in the hub. And you're like, why is that there? And then you click on it and you have notifications. And so what that does is it basically notifies you when work is due within the month or within the week, or if work is overdue, right? And so you can create work records and then assign a due date to those work records. And then when that due date rolls around, you then get notified in the notifications section. If you were to click on this link, can everyone see my mouse? Okay. If you were to click on this link right here in step 3, then a filter gets applied to the map automatically for just those trees. And what's being applied is it's going to basically apply filter to the due date, right? And the layer and the status of the work record because it's still open. And so using the notifications, you can keep track of that planned work, that proactive work over time. And that tends to be really helpful. So now let's kind of go into the reporting options. So there's a couple reporting options. Generally, we have CSVs and then we have PDFs, right? And depending on who you are and what you do, either option is good or, you know, a blend of the two is even better. And so for work records, the place to go to export out a CSV is in the data table. So if anyone here is familiar with the data table, you might know that you can set up your data table to only contain the columns that you want and then export that as your CSV, right? You can do the same thing for work records. It works the same way. So we would go into the hub and then over to the work records, work history table. And then we would click on more and export, and we would get our work records, right? Prior to exporting out the work, you want to make sure that your filter's set with all of the work that you want to export, or if you're just exporting out everything, you can do that too. The next bit of reporting that we have is we have some pretty elaborate reporting options. I don't know if a lot of people know about these or use them, but we did want to mention them today. So if you go into the hub in the top left corner, and then you go to reports, and then you go to work record, work history reports, there's a ton of options down here. So you can see work records by genus, you can see work records in like a summary where you have a couple different metrics that are being spit out in the report, or you can view them in a detailed format, which it kind of like shows a table. And so there's a ton of options in there. Feel free to experiment with them if you're starting to get into the work record thing. And then the thing that is complicated, this is the part that really trips people up, especially with a lot of the trainings that we've had over the last year. Exporting out work history. So in Tree Plotter, there is a difference between work history and there is a difference between work records. And like I said before, work records are the planned work and work history is the completed work, right? So when you complete a work record, it automatically becomes work history. And what also happens is that work record gets archived. And so if anyone here is familiar with archiving in Tree Plotter, that means that the tree or the work record in this case gets kind of like removed from the map and kind of hidden. And so we hear from people all the time that are having trouble exporting out work history, right? And that's because in order to export out work history, you have to isolate the work history using the filter first. So the first step here would be you're going to open up the filter. You're going to set a filter on the work records layer. And then you're going to set a filter on the archived fields. You're going to check that box, click apply like you normally would. And then the next step is going to be then you can go into the exporter and export out your work history. Any editing or exporting out of work history, there has to be a filter applied for that archived field, because if not, it'll default to the work records. I know that's kind of something that we go over a lot in our trainings, and I did want to mention it today. Okay, and so now Peter's going to take over, and we're going to start from the very beginning. So we're going to kind of set the stage where, you know, Peter has this application where work records just got added. So we're going to start with like how we would recommend setting up work records in your application.
Cool. You see my screen all right?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So yeah, again, like Maggie said, the first kind of initial step when you're getting started with work records is sort of like building out or customizing your work records fields. There's a handful of fields that you're going to be able to edit yourself on the front end. Any other additional edits, you'll have to reach out to support and we can help either create new fields or adjust field options or adjust the naming conventions. And we can also update the default field configurations. But again, we're going to start off with the fields that you are going to have access to. So within the hub, under data tools, you have your lookup table editor. Some of you might be familiar with the data field editor. This is where you're going to edit the majority of your fields in any other layer, but the work records are sort of separated out of those because they live within a tree. In your lookup table editor, there's a handful of fields in here that correspond with different layers, but the ones that we're going to focus in on are assigned to work categories and work tasks. All these other editable lookup tables are tied to the trees table in this case. If I wanted to edit my assigned to list, and again, this is going to be sort of my list of either my crew, contractors, or anybody within the organization that I would like to not only assign work to, but then let them find that work later on. This is going to be super important for them retrieving work. And again, we're going to talk about how they can set up filters and notifications to, again, like just kind of go right to that work that's assigned to them. So when I click on just this row here, I'll get this pop-up window. And from here, I can add, edit, delete, and fill out my user list. In some cases, we have clients who like to use direct individual names, or it could be by an entire crew. It all depends on the way your organization is set up, and we can meet with you and kind of talk about what other users are doing and give recommendations. But again, it's totally up to you. One thing I want to point out with this email option here is that this is not tied to any sort of external notification system. It's just a way to log additional information about that user. If you're interested in, again, swapping that out with a different field or editing in this kind of like additional column in any way, let us know and we can help with that. But it is pretty easy. Just press add to add an additional row at the bottom, hit this checkbox right here to delete a checked box. So again, that's how you're going to build out your users. Super essential later on for when we want to find the work that's been assigned to us. The next two options are your work categories and tasks. These are directly related. So the work tasks fit within the categories. So if we just take a peek at the categories, these are going to be the kind of the broad areas of work that we're going to be looking at. So we have inspections, plant healthcare, planting, protection. So again, you have a handful that are going to be what we call out of the box. They just come standard, but this is an editable list. You can change the naming around. So if you wanted to spell out plant healthcare, you can do that here. You can add, you can delete. The way that the work categories are going to be tied into your work tasks is the individual work tasks, which is where you can get pretty granular with the exact, objectivable task that's being assigned to a tree. It needs to be tucked inside of a work category. And this will play in later on. There's a few sort of like shortcut options to add work records. So you could just pick a category and then pick a task from there. It also helps for filtering. So if you wanted to look at all of your plant healthcare department's work in the future, you can quickly do that by just running a filter on that work category, plant healthcare, and then all the associated tasks will be within that filter. Another thing you'll notice here for those of our clients who have multiple layers beyond trees is that you also have a layer option to choose from. So for instance, if you add zones or an additional point layer, you can also designate what task is tied to what layer. So again, you can have work records on more than just trees. So if you had a polygon layer for managing turf and mowing rotations, you would need to configure all of this ahead of time. So this is sort of admin level work. The other thing I'm going to touch on briefly here is that there are multiple ways to track costs with work records. I'll show you this in a moment. There's a way to just give a fixed cost to a task. So let's say you're doing a tree removal in a backyard. It doesn't really fit within any broad categories. It's a unique situation. You're going to give it one cost at one point in time. However, for things like grinding stumps and plant healthcare applications, sometimes you have costs that are based off of different parameters like tree height or tree DBH. And what you can do here is I can select this work task, grind stump, and I can see there's already some cost associated with this. Up here in manage costs, I can see there's a table that allows me to add a cost range based off of, in this case, the DBH. So I can see if the tree is between 1 and 45 diameter breast height, then this cost will be automatically tagged to that tree. So again, it's pulling from the DBH field in this case, but I could also add something like tree height for other applications. And then you can build this out. So you can add, you can delete, you can manage plant healthcare costs. And this is one of the very few places in Tree Plotter that you do need to save your changes. For the most part, as you all know, if you make a change in the details form, it automatically gets saved. Closing out of the form doesn't save it. It's just automatically saved. You will have to save this. Conveniently, you get a pop-up letting you know if you haven't saved anything, if you've made changes. The other things I wanted to point out here is similar to any of our other editable lookup tables. You can delete, you can add. We just talked about managing costs, and then you can also export these out. So if you needed to, run a report and kind of like take a broader look at your costs, you can export out. You can do some bulk updating. So again, as an admin's kind of filling this out initially, you can do a lot of this at scale, and then you can set like key default cost options. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you want to go into any more depth on these cost options. Otherwise, I'm going to switch gears and go right into adding a work record to a tree. So the first thing I'm going to do is just start with one tree, one work record, and just kind of go through all the different buttons and bells and whistles that are associated with it. And then we'll switch gears to how to do this at scale, which is, I think, what a lot of people are interested in. But again, just to kind of get this basic foundation in a less complicated way, we'll just start with one tree. So in my scenario here, I'm just going to pick any tree. Again, as you should all know, with just general kind of tree plotter application, you have this pop-up window and we have a ton of shortcut buttons in here. You do have a WRS button, so that's short for work records. I can also access it in my details form. So if I go to my details form across the top here, I have a work records tab. And I'll show you again here just on a single tree how that shortcut button works. Just click on that button and notice it just opens up my details form, but it takes me right to the work records tab. So again, just a quicker way, less clicks to get to the place that you need to be. When you initially load this, you're going to get a handful of default fields. I'll show you in a moment how you can sort of set up custom views of different fields. But if you wanted these initial default fields to be changed, you'll have to reach out to support and we can give you a hand with that. We can configure these differently in the details form, which is what I'm referring to right here, and also in the data table. You can have a different combination of default fields. The reason that you might want to have a different combination of fields available is depending on the nature of the work that you're doing. So if you have a contractor, you might only want to give them access to a handful of fields so that they're not, they may not be concerned with the costs, but they are concerned with the hours and the task at hand. The plant healthcare crew may not want to get muddled up with all the fields that the removal crew is interested in. So again, you can set up these different combinations of views that can be really helpful for that sort of end user to just get from point A to point B as quickly and efficiently as possible. So before actually adding work, we're going to explore the views button here right a little bit. So when I open this up, the first thing you're going to notice is this My Views option. And this is what I was just referring to. This is where you can select from a list of view combinations that you've put together in the past. You can manage your views here, which will allow you to delete existing views or even override any views that you've created. Now you might be wondering, how do I put these combinations together? And that's that next piece here where we have the columns header. And you can see we have a handful that are already preloaded, right? These are those default fields. These are checked on already, and they're in the table. The other option is you can freeze a field, which means it's just going to hang out on the left side of that table. So if you have a great long list of fields, but for instance, you want like the ID to kind of stay persistent as you scroll around, you can freeze any field you want. And again, that just makes it easier as you're scrolling around a larger table to kind of keep track of what tree or what work record you're looking at. You can also add fields that exist in other layers. So one thing you might have noticed in this initial view here is we have a common name. So that's going to get pulled in directly from the tree details form. So I can add new fields. Again, for those folks who have multiple layers, you'll need to select your layer first, and then you'll see this great long list of all the other potential field options that you have. There's a little bit more that you can do with removing checked fields if you'd like to, and you can also sort. There's another place that you can sort. I'll show you in a moment. But for now, I'm just going to leave this set of default fields that we have available right here, but I just want to kind of scroll through and show that you have quite a few more fields to choose from outside of those default field options.
Hey,
if you're
Peter.
interested in tracking costs or hours, this is where you would bring that in. Do we have a question?
Yes. So someone Ansel was wondering if there was a free text field, and I had responded that there is the description. Do you mind adding that to the table so we can see it?
Yes, right here. So this is what Maggie was referring to, this description field. Perfect. Yeah, actually, to that point, does anybody else want anything else added to this? I mean, again, we talked about that fixed cost option, hourly rates, hours, things of that nature, because there is an additional element where if you have multiple work records, we can do totals, some hours, some costs, all that kind of stuff. So I'll leave that in here for now as well. But again, Maggie, if you don't mind keeping an eye on the chat, I can make any
Yep, I
adjustments.
gotcha.
Perfect. And then the last two elements of the views are different sorting options. So you can kind of have multiple tiers of sorting. This comes up quite a bit because it's not super apparent, like especially if you're on the primary field, especially when we get into the data table where you have tons of work records to sort through. Having those sorting options available can be really important. And then you can run additional filters from here as well. So if you had, if you just wanted to limit your view to like a certain category, you can do that from here. Down at the bottom is where you can apply the changes we just made. So I'm going to add description and fixed cost to this scenario. And I can also save this. So this is where I could, again, if I were to build out that contractor view, I would save it here, press save, and then I can either override an existing one or I can create a new view. So we'll apply that change. And now I can see I've added description and fixed cost to my fields, columns in this case, of the work records. So now we're going to get into adding work. It's pretty simple from this perspective. I press add work, and then it's going to give me one blank work record. And so again, this work record is attached to the tree. So I have one blank work record on this tree. As you start building this out, you will have multiple different types of work record associated with one tree. So one tree might have plant healthcare, pruning needs, watering needs, things of that nature. We're not going to get into work order management, but just as a side note, if you did feel the need to sort of categorize things at a broader scale, that's where work orders come into play. There's a lot we can do with filtering. So I'll show you some of that, but I just wanted to make a quick note of that. So again, that common name was automatically pulled in. I didn't have to do anything for that. The work task, as we explored earlier, is going to give me my most common options and then my categories, right? So this is what we talked about before. Those categories kind of come up later. And it just makes it so I don't have to fiddle through a big long list of, a mix up of different types of work tasks. So I can go down here and let's say we're removing this tree, click remove, and now I've added a task. And again, that removal category is going to be automatically captured for me. So I've added my task. I don't have to worry about the category. It's auto-loaded for us. And then the next thing we're going to explore is the status field. This is also an important field because this is what's going to trigger a work record being bumped into work history. What it's doing is it's auto archiving. So again, that terminology that Maggie talked about earlier, the kind of difference between a work record and work history. Again, that history and in the primary use case is that it's past tense work, right? We've completed the work. But what's really going on is you're archiving that task, right? So again, if you assign it to any of these three status options, it will stay as a work record, which means it will stay within the work record tab until you've completed that work. As soon as you complete it, it's going to archive and move into your work history tab. Sorry if my dog barks. So we'll just set this as scheduled for now. The next field that is also going to be pretty important to talk about is this due date field. We talked about notifications earlier. This field right here is what's going to tie that work record to your notifications. If you forget to or don't use this due date field, if you have a different date field that you're using, just keep in mind it will not get tied into the notification. So I can't remember the exact cadence, but I think it's like a month or a week out when it's due and then past due. And then it sets up this automatic filter for you to just very quickly find the trees that have that upcoming or past due work. So we'll set this for tomorrow. Then we have our assign to option, and this is going to open up this table. Again, you'll have your most common and then the rest of your list down here. One other thing I want to point out is with any of your editable lookup tables, you have this sort of like admin path, which is go to the hub, go to the data table, go to lookup table editor and make your changes in there. But if you're out in the field and you're like, oh, we've got this new staff member, we didn't add them into the system, you can edit this table directly from the form. So I just pressed edit table, and now you should recognize this is that same pop-up that we were looking at through the hub. So there's a lot of shortcuts and like quick connections and tree plotters. This is just one of those. So we'll give this to our removal crew contractor because we're doing removal. You asked about a freeform field. This is just going to be a text area. So we can add, test as an option in here. And then we're going to give it a fixed cost of $100. Let's say it's a small tree. So now that we have our work record built out, the other thing I wanted to note is you do have a photos field associated with work records. The really neat thing here is this is not going to muddle or mix with your existing tree photos or inspection photos, or even your work order photos if you have work order management. This photo is going to be unique to this work record. So again, this is used, I think, primarily for like kind of before and after photos, maybe a specific snapshot of the work that needs to be done, or like some insects you're seeing on a tree. This is where you can capture that. We do have a relatively new photo viewer option, which allows you to click on a tree and then you can see all of your photos and see what it's associated with. So whether it's a primary tree photo, an inspection photo, a work record photo, you can view them differently here. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of jump past this update option, then come back to it, is just talk about some of these additional buttons here.
Hold on.
Go ahead. Do you have some questions?
Can I interrupt? Yeah, we have some questions. So Jim had asked, do individuals need to add views? Is only the default a global view? Is there a way to have others have the view? So views work very similar in Tree Plotter to saved filters and saved routines, which Peter has not covered yet. All of those get set within a specific username. So they only get applied to right now where Peter is logged into. So if you try and refresh your page, you're not going to be able to see what Peter just saved, right? The alternative to that is that what we typically recommend is when you create a user, if you are needing to share views from your account into theirs, what you can do is log in as that user when you create their username and resave those views in their login, right? So that's one option. The second option is going to be to send them something like a map scenario, right? Which we won't get into. If you guys need to know what a map scenario is, I can send the support article over the chat. But basically, you could send a map scenario with the filter applied or the view applied, and then they can go in and actually save it under their account, right? The third option is that we can duplicate views and routines on our end. However, you're going to have to wait for us. That's downside. And then you're also going to, it's just time intensive and it's kind of a manual process. So, yeah. So I don't love when we do it, but yeah. Yeah, the second question Brittany asked, can you cancel a work record? So canceling a work record, that's an interesting concept. I mean, you can delete a work record, right? So, or you can change the status. So if you wanted to change the status and have it be canceled instead of completed, you can reach out to us at support and we can get that option added for you. So the work record statuses are not editable on your end, but if you did need to add them, we can add one in for you. No problem. When you do complete it, it does get archived.
Yeah, so it really depends on like what your hope is there. So if you wanted to keep track of canceled work, then I think, yeah, what Maggie said, adding it to this status field, either as that completed, because then it auto archives it and it's just like history, it kind of goes out of that view, but you can go look back and see what work was canceled. Alternatively, if you're just like, it's canceled, we're not going to revisit it, we don't need to keep a record of it, you just delete the work record.
Mm-hmm.
To that point, the next thing I was going to talk about is some additional buttons in here, and so we'll get into things like deleting. Zoom to is just going to bring you back to the point on the map. So let's say you move the map a little bit, or you're looking at this large group of trees right here, and I intentionally clicked off of it, so now I'm no longer highlighting the tree that I was on. It usually has a little ring in that pop-up window. If I needed to figure out what tree I'm making updates to, the Zoom to option is going to do this for me. And then hiding under more, this is where I can delete work records. So this is going to be an option under work records. When we get into work history, we'll talk about what happens with, if you need to like delete or recover work history, different things of that nature. But you're going to have to use this checkbox right here to designate which one you want to delete. If you do not have anything checked, it's a little bit of a tongue twister, but it's essentially the same thing as having everything checked. So if you don't check that box of the one that you want, press delete, it could potentially delete all your work records. So just keep an eye on that. You will get a pop-up letting you know, hey, you're about to delete, X amount of work records, and it'll notify you of that. Next, you can duplicate a work record. So this is going to be a carbon copy of that work record, including the due date. So again, it'll just be an exact carbon copy of the work that you've just created, which I'll go ahead and do. I can also use these checkbox options to duplicate as many times as I want. So I'm just going to duplicate once, which is going to now give me 2 of the same work record. Kind of a silly situation with removals, but again, just to kind of show you how we go through this process. Unlike duplicating, scheduling work allows you to duplicate work over time within a time period. So you can kind of set bounds on it. I think one of the most common examples I see people use this for is tree watering, right? You plant a tree, it needs to be watered for that first season, maybe 2, and you want to set up multiple work records to visit that tree once a week for the summer. You're going to use this schedule option to do that. So the big difference between duplicating and scheduling, so you are just creating multiple additional rows, but the due date field is going to change according to your cadence. So again, that weekly watering, it'll generate, whatever, 10 waterings 1 week apart, and you will see that in the due date field, which will tie back to those notifications. It'll tie back to filtering later on for the assigned to category. So again, the scheduling option I think is super handy for that sort of proactive work, plant healthcare, planting, watering, things of that nature. The highlight option is going to allow me to view the tree amongst the rest of my trees without losing that visualization of those trees. So if I were to run a filter on this work record right now, the filter tool is going to completely remove all other tree points from the map. The highlight option, on the other hand, is just going to highlight that tree and turn the rest of them to be opaque. So this is helpful if you have a cluster of trees and you're trying to figure out which one you're supposed to be working on. You can run that highlight option and it'll show you, relative to the rest of your trees in a tight area, where the trees you're supposed to be working on. Next, you have the sync work records button and the refresh button. So the sync work records button is going to pull in any changes that have been made in the tree details to fields that are linked in your work record. So again, if this tree was misidentified, it's not a queen palm, it's a different species of palm, someone went through and made that edit in the tree details form and you wanted to reflect that in your work record, you'd press the sync work records button and it will pull in the most up-to-date information from your details form. The refresh button, on the other hand, is going to refresh changes that have been made within the work record. And one place that does come into play would be with your costs. There's a subtotal option that doesn't automatically fire as you're creating work records. You'd want to press this refresh button to see that subtotal out. Alternatively, if I were to close and reopen the form, that also fires the automation. So it does run in the background. You don't need to press the refresh button to apply that refresh, but it's just kind of a way to manually override it if you want to see that change right away. I'm going to pause here just to make sure there weren't any other questions coming in the chat that I can address on screen. If not, Maggie, I know that you're typing away over there.
I am typing. So I'm a really quick typer, but it's also really loud. Okay, so we had some questions on photos. So I want to cover that a little bit. So
yeah,
photos. You get 5 per tree typically, and we can increase the number of photos. I don't remember if we charge for that though, so we would want to check. And then 5 per tree, but then per work record, you should get 5 also, right? The thing with the 5 work records, or sorry, the thing with the 5 photos in the work record is that you do have to have the photo saved in your camera roll, to my knowledge.
That sounds right.
Yeah. So you take your photos and then you import them into that work record, and that should work fine. Taking them with your camera, from what I've seen, it kind of overwrites and it'll just insert the last photo that you took with your camera. So the other thing is the photo viewer, right? So we recently rolled out a photo upgrade in Tree Plotter that has all of the photos, right? And so it has everything in it. So you'll see the asset photos, meaning the tree photos, the work record photos, and then also inspection photos also. And there's also a report with all of it if you wanted to get really fancy. So
Yeah.
if that does not answer your question, Taylor, or I think it was Mihai, let us know.
Cool. Unless there's any other questions, I'm going to move
One
on.
more, sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries, please. Yeah.
So I missed Laura's, and I do want to
Yeah.
address that. So
Good.
essentially, Laura asked, from Burlington, asked, when we complete work records, it doesn't automatically archive. Is this a new feature? Kind of. So if you have full work order management, the work records do not automatically archive. If you have full work order management, the work records will archive when you close out a work order. And that's the way that it's built. If you would like to change that, we can change that. But if there's any kind, the closing out of the work record and the archiving of it gets a little complicated because I believe, as Ian pointed out, it's hard to edit the work records after you archive them, right? There is a way to do
Right.
it. But
Yeah.
if you do have full WOM and you want to change that, just let us know. But if there's any administrative thing that has to be done to the work records in a work order before you close out, you want to be careful with the auto archiving. We can also uninstall the auto archiving in a regular Tree Plotter app that just has work records. So Ian, if you wanted to uninstall that, we could.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is that, some of our larger municipal clients who have both, full WOM and work records prefer not to auto archive just because it allows them to go out in the field, kind of press as few buttons as possible on a tablet or a phone, then go back to the office, use the mass updater on a desktop, which is a lot easier, just kind of manipulating those tables. They'll go through and update hours and costs and any other figures along those lines, and then they'll manually archive, move into work history. So again, it's totally up to the user. Feel free to reach out to us and we can kind of go through your app and figure out, what automations you have and don't have, and then work with you to make the changes that you're interested in. Cool. To that point, the next thing I'm going to talk about is updating. And again, we're kind of going through this on one tree, then we'll switch gears and do this at scale, and all the same buttons are going to be there, so we'll be really familiar with it by then, right? With the update feature, this is going to open the mass updater, but it's going to be preset on your work record. So again, this is one of those prerequisite fields. We recommend being as comfortable as you can with that mass updater before jumping into this, just because you can mess up your data as well. But don't be too afraid. We pull nightly backups, and we're more than willing to help out if catastrophe strikes. So again, please don't be dissuaded from using this tool because it's really powerful and really helpful. Using the mass updater from within the work records tab within your details form is already going to be set up on your work record, right? So you can see we're mass updating work records, and it's going to be automatically set up to sort of, be tied to the tree that we're working on, right? So we have 2 work records in here already, and we can recognize that right here. It says 2 work records. So even though I have a ton of sites and I'm not really filtering on those sites, again, if you're familiar with the mass updater, you would see very different numbers. But in this case, we only have the 2. So be sure to check those numbers before mass updating, just because, again, it's just, you want to make sure it makes sense to the task that you're doing. Similar to views, we have routine options in here, right? So this is where you might have different combinations of mass updating that you might do. And again, this will play a little bit more into when we have a larger group of trees that we're making a mass update to. But for now, some really common situations would be like, okay, I have a pruning cycle that I'm working on, and I assign it to the same crew, the same task, the same due date, the same costs every single time. And I don't want to have to, click through each one of these boxes every time I do that. I also don't want to add those fields every time. So I have a work task, I have a status, I have assigned to, and I have, a fixed cost that's associated with that. So it's like every time I'm doing the same routine, You can build this out once, so this is sort of that admin level work, save it as a routine, and then you'll be able to click on this drop-down menu and select from a list of pre-built routines so that as you're going through your work, you can just very quickly assign those tasks out or fill in, complete work records. That's another really common one, is that you want to go through and complete all your work. You want to auto archive all your work. Routines are going to be really handy for this. So we'll set this up the first time. We're going to switch gears. We're going to do a plant healthcare. We're going to do a $50 plant healthcare treatment. So we're going to kind of switch this around. Let's do some air excavation, and we're going to schedule this work, right? So we're going to override both of these existing work records. We decided to keep the tree, and we're going to do some air excavation to try and save it, right? So we're going to go ahead and update. Here's that big scary pop-up warning that's going to come up every time, just letting you know you're about to do something at scale. Again, don't be too afraid. Get comfortable with the tool. Reach out to support if you run into any issues. This is an awesome tool to get work done quickly. So now, as you'll see, I just mass updated all of those without clicking through, 6 different boxes to follow the work that I wanted done on those. Cool. Before I switch gears and start doing this at mass, is there any question on doing this on just a single tree? And I'm going to go ahead and clean this up while we're waiting for questions.
Yep. So we have a question. When conducting a mass update, is there a way to select a bunch of trees at once? Such as if I was needing to target a specific neighborhood for pruning, would I be able to quickly select all the trees in that area and create a work record for or work order for each as a grouping rather than individually? Yes, we're going to go over that. So hold that question, Joe. That's a good
perfect segue for me, actually.
Yeah.
the one thing I will point out with that, just while we're kind of like dealing with the simple one tree at a time, is the advanced filter is connected to that mass updater. So if you did want to just look at a single tree species, a single neighborhood, another thing that came up recently is we have a client who has a 5-year pruning rotation, and they want to designate which grouping they're working on at a time. So they would use that filter ahead of time, give me year 1 pruning, blah, 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 and then they could, go through that work. So again, the filter tool, a very important prerequisite for this tool, because there's so much that's tied into it for reporting, for isolating your trees, so on and so forth. Okay, to your question, we're going to switch over to doing this at scale. And instead of starting with the filter, because you can start with the filter, like I just mentioned, if you were like, I know I'm working in this neighborhood, I know I'm working on ash trees, you could have that filter running ahead of time before jumping into this. But there's also ways to access the filter from this mass work record generation option, right? So what we're going to do is, instead of clicking on an individual tree, we're going to go to the data table. It was kind of already open for me here, but you'll have your trees. In this case, we're in an app with client sites and zones. We're looking for this work record / work history tab right here. From within here, I can see any work records, right? So this will be one long list of every single tree. And this is a relatively empty client site right now. There's not a ton of work in here, but with no filters running, you would just see a huge long list of all the work on all the trees. And this is where that sorting can be really handy, right? Same goes for my work history. So I have these sub tabs within this option here. All of the history of all of the trees will be in here, and it will just be a giant list of work unless you run a filter. So running that filter and sorting is going to allow you to isolate, different points of interest. There's also some instructions hiding in here, but we'll skip over that since we're in this webinar. In this case, I'm going to make sure that I'm designating the fact that I'm working on the trees layer. Again, this is only applicable to clients that have multiple layers. And we're going to go ahead and start adding work records to trees. So similar to adding it on a single tree, I have an add button, but now this is going to look a little bit different. I can select the layer that I want to work in. I'm going to leave this as trees. And then the next option is I'm going to choose how I want to link the work records to my trees. And I have several options here. Point is just going to allow me to select one tree at a time to create a work record for. Again, that's very similar to what we just did because it's one tree, one work record. Multiple points allows me to just click on the individual trees. So if I have a row of trees and like 3 are being removed, I can just go select those individual trees. create, those 3 work records for the removal task, and then go ahead and mass update the rest to be pruned or inspected, right? Polygon, which is the one I'm going to use here in a moment, is going to allow me to draw a polygon on the map and isolate the group of trees that I want to create a work record for based off of just their location on the map. So there is no other field tying them together, just smattering of species and different inspection cycles and work tasks. Again, you can just use the location on the map to collect the trees that you like to add work records to. As I mentioned a moment ago, you can also access your advanced filters. So you don't need to have a filter running ahead of time. You could go right into the data table, add work, and then say, give me this filter. I want to filter on my ash trees under good condition, under a certain location, and I'm going to do my emerald ash borer treatments on those trees, right? And then last, if you did happen to have a list of PIDs, so again, these are the primary IDs of those trees. If you had a list and you knew those trees needed to be worked on, you can select them by ID. If there's more than one, you'll just need to separate those with a comma. So for this example, I'm going to use the polygon option. I've chosen polygon, and now I need to press the link button. And now I can see down here, it says done linking if I want to exit this. And on screen, I have a blue dot chasing my cursor around. I'm going to click once to start drawing my polygon, click a second time to create a pivot point, and then double click to close my polygon. Notice done linking kind of automatically went away. That can be helpful if you're like trying to like just do a small group at a time. But what I just did is I automatically created 149 work records. So I have 149 trees, I have 149 work records, and notice that is one unique individual work record per tree. So that's not 149 on one tree, that's one per tree, right? And so now I'm done with this step. And before moving on, I want to point out one thing here is you can also add work or track work on non-inventoried trees. This is kind of an edge case. I think the most common example is if you're working within a certain jurisdiction and you see a tree that needs maintenance or like a branch on the ground that's not within your work zone, but you want to kind of make a note of it or capture that work somehow, you can create a row of work that needs to be done that's not linked to a tree directly. The big difference you'll see is instead of this zoom option right here, so this crosshair, if I clicked on this, it would zoom me to that tree from the row. You get a big black plus sign, which would then allow you to add that tree after the fact if you wanted to. Otherwise, you just have sort of this like floating work task that needs to be executed, again, like a limb on the ground. Maybe you don't know what tree it came from, but the work needs to be done. And then you can have a history log of that change that happened. Any questions before moving forward?
Nope.
Okay, cool. So used to that during trainings, it's like a lot more dynamic.
I know, we have people talking to us instead.
Right, exactly. Cool. So now I have my my work added, and again, we're going to go through a very similar flow to what we went to before. If I wanted to view different fields or update different fields, I have my views option. I can pick different routines. So again, if I were to say all of these trees need to be pruned, and I have this pre-built routine, I could go select from that list, and I'd be done right away. Right? We're going to go through it the slow way. So we're going to do the update option. And then we're going to update, we're going to add work, add a task. Let's say we're going to do clearance pruning on all of these trees, make that update again. I'm not going to go through all the steps just because everyone's pretty familiar with it at this point. And then you can see it auto created all those different work tasks for us. The other thing I wanted to point out, I did mention here that you can zoom to a tree, but you can also run a report on an individual work record from the data table. So I think this is also pretty interesting and pretty handy. If I wanted to click on this, it's going to open up a single report. This is going to be the most detailed of the reports, and it's going to give you a ton of interesting information, including photos and things of that nature. I am going to actually do one more mass update. I'm going to assign these to a user, because the next thing I want to show you is how, okay, we've created all these work records. How do we then go find them moving forward? So I'm actually going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to check on a handful. So this is the same as filtering away. I'm selecting these work records to be mass assigned to one user. We're going to do plant healthcare. No, we're going to do Patrick. There we go. update, yes. So now we have a handful of these assigned to Patrick, and then we're gonna assign a handful to another user. So we're gonna go mass update, assign to, we're gonna give these ones to Mike. Done. Okay. So now we have two different users who each have work assigned to them. And now we need to figure out how do those users log in and they don't have to sift through this long list of work. Like how do they just find their work as quickly as possible, right? They, on one hand, they could open up the data table and, assign, filter by assigned to and figure out what work they have assigned to them, but that's, pretty tenuous to go through. And so now we're going to switch over to the advanced filter. And we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between like admin level work, like what you would want to do to sort of like set yourself up for success, and then what that end result is going to look like for that end user. And that kind of ties into that question earlier of, can you share these views? And again, yes, those map scenarios, and there's a little bit of backend work, or you can log in and kind of preload these for your users, and we can help with that. But what you're going to do here is you're going to need to filter on the work records layer. So right now I'm automatically set to the trees layer when I open the filter because it's linked to the trees layer right here. If I press this green plus, I'm going to have a list of additional layers to filter on. I'm going to choose work records. I'm going to choose assign to. And again, I remember Mike, done selecting. And then from here, if Mike maybe did multiple levels of work, they could choose what additional categories, tasks they were interested in filtering on. Just to keep it simple, we're just going to do the assign to for now. And then from here, I'm going to apply that. And that's going to immediately show me the trees that Mike has work assigned to, right? Now, instead of logging on and needing to run that filter every single time, again, Mike, work task is pruning, so on and so forth. What I can do is I can save a view filter. I can either override an existing one or create a new view. I'll call this Mike's work. Save it. And now notice over here in the legend, we have a save view filter option under Mike's work. So now when Mike logs in, he can just go right to the save view filter and it'll pull up all of the work that has been assigned to him. And again, you can get way more specific, way more granular with this. But this is the shortest path to find the work that has been assigned to you. You can add due dates. You can add a lot more specificity to this if you wanted to. Now, let's say Mike has completed all of his work and he wants to mass close these out, right? That's where you can go back to that data table, go to the update function, go to, again, if you had a routine of closing your workout, you'd have that preloaded. Again, this is sort of that admin level work. But in this case, we just have that one piece. So we're just going to go ahead and complete all these. Yes. And now this is where we're going to kind of switch gears into troubleshooting a little bit. Because one thing that does come up quite a bit is, depending on if you have this automation or if you don't, you went and completed all your work and all of a sudden your work records disappeared. And as you can see, they disappeared and you're wondering where those went. They were bumped into work history. So now that work has been completed, it's been moved into the history tab. And from here, there's a couple of differences in the way that you would access and update this information. So one thing I'm going to point out is that from a details form, I go to the details, I go to history, I go to sub-tab work history. I'm going to see this work in here, but I can't make any edits to this. This is totally locked up. So let's say Mike forgot to add his hours in, he completed already, and he needs to make a change to this. Don't worry, Mike, you can go over here to the data table and you can make changes in here. So if Mike needed to make a change to just one row at a time, they can do that from here. The other option is to use the mass update feature, but where this gets a little bit tenuous, and this was addressed earlier in the slide presentation, is there's one additional field that you need to add to make any changes to archived work records, aka work history. So you're going to have to go to archived and then set archived as true, run this filter, and now I am only looking at my completed work records, aka work history. This is going to be super important for reporting as well, right? So if we wanted to export out our work history, you need to have this archive feature turned on. If you wanted to run a report on work history, you're going to also want to have this archive feature turned on. Cool. And that's kind of where I was going to leave things. So I wanted to leave some space for additional questions. And Maggie was also going to talk a little bit more about reporting options, I think.
Yeah, I think I might skip that because we're kind of running out of time. And I did mention them before. If you just want to open up the hub and the reports.
Yep. So let me clear
That would
these.
probably be good. But the question that I had, Peter, that I think would be good to talk about is what happens when you filter, what happens to the trees on the map when you filter on work records? If you want to just like point that out for a second. So Peter just had a filter applied for for archived, right? And assigned to.
So in this case, we are going to see the work history that's associated with those. But if I don't have that running, no trees. And again, it's because that filter or the work records are tied to the trees always. They are not independent of the trees. In this case, they are linked to those trees. So this is another scenario that does come up pretty often. So if you're trying to find work or work history or work records and you didn't have your filter combination set up correctly, just know you are by kind of like default filtering on your trees as you're filtering on your work records. But it also affects this data table here as well. So you'll see I have my work records here. And then if I clear all filters, this is a moment to process. Now they've come back, right? Cool. And then I'll bounce back over to the reports, work record, work history reports. So yeah, Maggie, did you want to talk through any of these?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I want to point out is that the only way that the work history reporting or the CSV exports end up working is when you have that archived checked and included in your filter. That was kind of all that I wanted to point out.
Here too.
The other thing that I did want to point out, Peter, is there are two more things. So if you open up the filter, this is kind of a little thing I learned, which is like, whoa, a couple weeks ago, actually. So if you go under the work records layer and you click on layer filter settings, under there. Yep. There is actually a way to filter on any trees that don't have work or trees that do have work. Now, what I've noticed with this is that it's pretty well known that when you set a filter in the filter, it reacts in the data table. What I've found with this is that it's a little glitchy with this section of the filter. You might not see the correct number of records applied. So if you go and do a mass update in the data table, it might be good to just check your numbers a second time. But it is helpful because if you are like, oh, I created work yesterday and I don't know what trees I didn't do work on, you know, you could easily find them that way. You could also do the date filtering. And then you can find any trees that don't have any record of work on them in your city. So if you have an inventory, I know we have bigger cities on the line here. Like if you have 100,000 trees in your inventory, 200,000 trees, 1,000,000 trees, which is the biggest tree plotter app in all of history, you know, you could filter on any trees that haven't had work done, ever.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, that tends to be nice. The other thing, what was I going to point out? Oh, in the data table. Now, you'll notice for work records that there are fields that are shared with the trees, right? So we have common name in there. There's DBH added as a field in work records. There are ways to add even more fields, right? So I know that I've been talking with some customers who are here right now about like, okay, how do I keep my trees updated with the work status information, right? So you might have like a planting status in the tree or the date planted in the tree. And so all of those tree fields can be added into the routines that Peter was sharing. So if you wanted to update information in the tree while you're doing the work, you can include those in the routine. The other part is that if you go into the views section, there is underneath the word columns, it says add new field. And what this allows you to do is actually add it to the table as a field option. So if you wanted to see the crown spread of the tree, as an example, while you're doing work to it, or if you wanted to see the chemicals, I don't know what the chemicals field has in it, but you could see that as part of the table as well. So once you add it, I think you just have to go in and click on canopy shape or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Canopy shape. So yeah, and then see, notice it says in parentheses trees, so you know that this is directly linked to your trees layer, and that sync button will pull any updates or changes to the tree into there. And then yeah, exactly what Maggie was just saying, if you needed to backfill tree information in. So some of our clients use within the tree, they'll put in recommendations via something like the management tab. And let's say you have like an all works completed option within management. What you could do is you could close out your work record in that routine, have all works completed from the trees layer close out. So again, that's a way to kind of have those work back and forth. And then one thing, not to steal your thunder, Maggie, because this is something that you came up with, is you could add that field to your display by, and that's a way to visually see on the map work being completed on the trees level from a work record, which does come up pretty frequently. Is, you know, as I'm kind of completing work on the map here, I'm looking at the species, looking at the condition, I'm looking at the maintenance here. You know, how do I see what trees had work done to them that day? So that's a way that you can do that.
Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of a workaround. But yeah, sometimes we need those. Any other questions? It's kind of died a little bit. I hope everyone is still awake.
There was
At least if it's like a normal hour where you are. Michelle brought up wondering if the webinars are recorded. They're always recorded. So don't feel like you have to wake up at 4 a.m. to join us. I know that this time was not a Australia friendly time. So if you're in Australia and you're awake, it's okay. We'll send you a recording. And I think we might have one for Australia, depending on the turnout of this. So
yeah. And then I don't know if this got fully addressed, but Ian, you asked about unarchiving work essentially, right? So that's going to be done through the advanced filter and the mass updater. So you can filter on archived work, and then you'd specify maybe the PID of the tree, or actually in this case, you probably want to get as specific as the work record itself. So you type in that work record ID is archived, that'll isolate that work record for you. And then you'd use the mass updater to unarchive it. Because as you'll notice, even in the data table, that is a locked field. You cannot unarchive from there. The only way to do that is with the mass updater.
yeah.
I think part of that is just because, you know, in theory, once work's completed, it should stay in there. It's kind of like inspections. Once you've inspected a tree, it's like that past tense work should stay in there. But there are ways around it if you needed it.
Yeah, and everyone's human and they make mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
So it happens. Yeah, if I know there's a lot of like mass updating and filters and like all these like complex tools that you might not have had too much exposure to. So if there is ever a mess up, understand that, you know, we do keep backups of the application on a nightly basis, and we can always restore back to the day before, the end of day, the day before if we need to. That's like a worst case scenario. The other thing that we have done before is kind of like try and backtrack the best that we can. With work records, it gets a little difficult, but depending on the severity of the issues, sometimes there's more that we can do, not to have to revert to the day before. Yeah. I hope everyone's still with us.
Yeah, we got some smiley faces in the chats.
Good. Yeah. If there's any more topics that you guys want to see for these webinars, I really would love to do more of these training events. And so I've been really excited about them on my end, especially after the user conference. And so if there's anything that you guys want to see, please, please, please reach out to support at Planet Geo and we're going to get a list started. We've been having a lot of work record trainings, and so that is why I was like, we need to have one on work records first, obviously. But we've thought about doing inspections and filtering mass updater things and yeah, all that. So any suggestions, let us know. Thank you guys.